Welcome, everybody, to First Principles Podcast. We are your podcast dedicated to analyzing complex subjects from first principles. You are joined by your host, yours truly, Trees, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Mr. Elliot. Okay, so today's episode, we are going to be taking a look at the new IPCC climate change report. You might have heard some news articles that were covering it, and we're going to be taking a look at not the report itself, but more so some articles that are analyzing the report. And we're going to try to break them down and maybe try to look at how they are analyzing the science. Are they doing a good job? Are they doing a bad job? Are they representing the information from the IPCC report accurately? What are some biases? What are some maybe general narratives that are taking place from these reports that are coming out that are analyzing the IPCC report? So, and just to give you guys my take on things is that from a broad scale, the IPCC report, it's not something that I'm here to dispute, because I believe climate change is happening, and we need to kind of break it down into like something more specific, though, in terms of understanding it and then communicating it to the public at large. And my question is, based on the findings of the report, are these articles, are these newspapers, these journal articles, whatever, or newspaper articles, the reporting on it in an accurate way, or is there some misrepresentation of the information in order to promote certain biases and certain ideas? So any thoughts on that before we jump into it, Elliot?
My thought is there is a narrative that underlies a lot of media that is along the lines of making any topic more extreme than it really is. Because once you put a sense of urgency or catastrophe or crisis or apocalypse, once you start using these types of language, it makes great headlines, and it adds to clicks. And I think the natural tendencies of media companies are to perhaps choose a course that might not be choose a narrative that's not completely true in order to basically increase their viewership. Right.
They'll kind of go for the clickbait thing, is what you're saying. They'll kind of get the like a detractive headline or write things in a certain way that creates some sort of sense of controversy when there really is nothing.
Yes. And it's not like the most simple form of clickbait, which is just a horrendously out there headline. Mm-hmm. It can be more subtle than that, but it is equally as deceptive. And I think there's almost like the clickbait you see at the bottom as like ads that might be something about some actor, this person said this, like more gossipy stuff. But then there's the headlines that seem to be in NBC, CBC, that are there, and they are controversial enough that they light up the Twitterverse. This is the intellectual clickbaity stuff that really just does well for discussion on social media, like within like the Twitter sphere. So I feel like clickbait is a right term for what they're doing, but it's more subtle in some cases than others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because people love a car crash, right? It's like a catastrophe. It's that's why when you're driving along the highway or something, and then there's road traffic block or whatever, and you pass by the car crash, well, there was nothing really impeding the traffic. It was just people slowing down to look at the car crash. So people, I think, do have that natural tendency towards clamoring towards some chaos or some crazy stuff that's happening. And if you can paint that narrative, paint that picture, then people are going to be more likely to click on your articles, I guess. which is the issue at play here. So without further ado, let's kind of look into a couple of these articles. So number one is in an article by the Washington Post, and it's titled 5 Key Excerpts from the United Nations Climate Change Report. And actually, just to take a step back, one other thing I want to mention is that this is an episode in a series which will be dedicated towards IPCC, climate change, that kind of stuff, because it is such a big discussion. The report is like 4,000 pages, whatever, and we want to really just look at it from many different angles, look at many different perspective, points of view on it, and really just chisel away at it and really try to provide value that way, instead of just one-off articles here and there that discuss it, but really just try to be one part in a series that tries to analyze all the elements of what is being discussed, because again, it's 4,000 pages. There's a lot to unpack there. So jumping into this newspaper article, again, 5 key excerpts from the United Nations Climate Change Report, and I'm gonna just kind of point out certain sections that to me sounded a bit off reading this article, but again, it's kind of like as it sounds. They try to highlight at a high level some key takeaways from the IPCC UN climate change report. So one thing that stood out to me as I was reading it was this statement that comes out that the last decade was more likely than not warmer than any multicentennial period after the last interglacial, roughly 125,000 years ago. So kind of a lot, kind of complex statement over there. But one thing that I want to point out, though, is just in terms of the metrics. Like, I don't know if there's something that stands out to you right away of that.
Could you read that to me one more time?
Okay, it says the last decade was more likely than not warmer than any multicentennial period after the last interglacial, roughly 125,000 years ago. So the keyword to me is decade, and then multicentennial period. Like, that to me sounds off, because you're comparing, and this is like a really nitpicky type of stuff, but again, like when it comes to, I don't know, science and numbers and this types of shit, like you do have to kind of be nitpicky and on that level. So as the last decade, so you're looking at 10-year, all right, what a decade is, was more likely than not was more likely than not warmer than any multicentennial period after the last interglacial. So you're now comparing to a multicentennial period. So now you're talking about hundreds of years.
And multiples of them. A multicentennial. So
so maybe they're trying to say that maybe it's even worse than it sounds, right? Because it's like a decade versus it's changed more in the last decade than in any 100-year period. Maybe that's what they're saying, but you have to look at, you're not comparing apples to oranges, essentially, it would be my rebuttal. Because if you're looking at a 10-year decade, then you should be analyzing 10-year periods within the last however many years you want to scale back to, whether it's the last 10,000 years, 100,000 years, million years, whatever. But if you're going to compare the last decade and maybe you would say that, oh, you know what? Well, we're comparing a decade and it's been more than a 100-year period. Well, what is it? Is that net or is that gross? So are we talking about the difference like after 10 years versus after 100 years? Or are we talking about like throughout? Because then that also is a difference as opposed to like as in the endpoints. Are we talking about the endpoints or in between as well? Because it could have gone like for a short period outside that range and then come back within that range over the long period. So you see what I'm kind of going at with this?
I do, but I think your initial or your interpretation, you kind of got to where they're trying to make the point that within 10 years we have more change than we're seeing over these multicentennial years, is probably what they're trying to trying to say there, which is a way of saying basically the amount of change that's happened in just the last 10 years is high. And it's higher than what we've seen before. But I agree that the language that's used in these reports is in itself misleading, because multicentennial, what the heck does that even mean? Like, that in itself needs a definition to help at least anybody,
the
average reader, put it into a frame of reference. Like, you could take it for what each of those individual words mean exactly, or this could be a term that you need to look up in the glossary that means a specific type of thing. So yeah,
But then my question to that would be, why wouldn't they say the last 100 years has been the warmest in the last multi-centennial of the last 125,000 years? That, you know what I'm saying? Because if that were true, then so if the 10-year decade thing was true, then the 100-year thing should be true as well, or one would think. But yet this last 10 years is isolated. Maybe they would say that, oh, we want to highlight how extreme the last 10 years has been. I don't know, but it just maybe goes towards skewing statistics in a way that tries to further your narrative and your agenda.
Okay, I think I know what you're saying, and I kind of agree with it, because the simplest way to say what they're trying to say is something along the line, in the last 10 years we've seen more change than the last 10,000. That would be the easiest way of saying it. But then to bring in these multicentennials gives some kind of wiggle room for that interpretation of the data to go one way or the other. And it's hard to describe on a podcast what we're talking about, but it's something along the lines of that. If you strategically place the boundaries of that centennial in such a way, you could probably manipulate what the change was over that period of time, and in that way paint a narrative that is different than simply the sentence that I said at the beginning there, which is like, in the last 10 years we've had more temperature change than in the last 10,000. But why can't they just say that?
Yeah,
you got to wonder why.
It's really these subtle games that are played that it just, to me, sounds kind of disingenuous from what science is, because it's supposed to be kind of like putting the facts out there.
Yeah, but in their defense, I would say the language has the potential to be to hide something, but at the same time, the one thing I've noticed with the climate report is they're often looking at the changes over time that are cyclical. So there's like means and amplitudes and stuff like that. So the way you compare things is not simply always as easy as just like, oh, it's just warmer. It's like you have to talk about differences in net and the height of a cycle and the length of a cycle. It gets more complicated when you're talking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have to choose a baseline. So it's like, what's the baseline that you choose? You're going to choose a baseline that kind of maybe favors the data towards the way that you want it. There's even that much more wiggle room in that case, because you are dealing with relatives. You are dealing with not necessarily absolutes, but you're comparing to a different time scale. That's why, like, we're always like, oh, we want to go to pre-industrial levels, or we want to go to pre-2010 levels with our emissions and all that stuff. Right. So moving on though, just continuing on with the article. So one of the things that it states is that neither scientists nor United Nations uses terms such as unequivocal lightly. We're very careful around confident statements. He said, what you're seeing here is a very strong statement. And discussions around climate change often involve idea of keeping the planet from warming beyond certain thresholds, such as 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius, the latter of which scientists and policymakers have identified as a red line if the planet is to avoid catastrophic and irreversible consequences. So we hear about the 1 to 2 degrees Celsius red line. And we also hear that there's strong confidence statements, and that they're not taken lightly. But reading the IPCC report, like in terms of the definitions of likely or more likely than not, like I don't know how they're not that readily findable in terms of what they mean in terms of these definitions.
Oh, this is my biggest beef so far with the IPCC report, is something that they've called IPCC calibrated uncertainty language, and it consists of italicizing words and then defining a confidence interval from. But you think it would be as simple as like 4 words and 4 confidence intervals. But no. If you go to these footnotes, there's a whole list of different terms and what they mean, and some are like reasonable, where it's talking about extremely likely, for example, is like 95 to 100%. But then there's something like likely, which is from 66 to 100, which is a much larger probability realm. And the one I saw that I'm just like, this is quite honestly a deceptive way of using language. So the language is about as likely as not. When you hear about as likely as not, what does that mean to you in terms of probability? As likely as not. I'll tell you,
50.
That's exactly it. You think it's likely not? It's like it's a toss of a coin. It's as likely to happen as it's not likely. But in the IPCC report, it's from 33 to 66.
Wow.
And so it's like,
so technically the 50 is right in the middle.
50 is right in the middle.
50 is right in the
50 is right in the middle. But this is the thing. Something that is 33%. Let's say you have something that is as likely as not in the language, you don't know if that's 33% or 66%.
Exactly. It could be unlikely in that case.
It could be very unlikely. Yeah, pretty unlikely.
But then the language states the opposite. It's like that. That's the thing with these types of games, these word manipulations that are made, and even though there's like this idea of transparency, it's hidden behind all these layers of semantics and overload of word definitions, all these things, where it's like they're not even going to use standard statistics. They're going to use IPCC specific statistics, like, again, to further make this their own unique thing that only they can understand, only the specialists, only the IPCC can interpret. If you dare challenge, if you dare like look into the data, if you dare question it for any second, you are unworthy of this. Because you are not of the IPCC, you are not educated, you are not elite, you are not an intellectual to these standards that they have set for themselves. I don't know. It's kind of like, again, like I am somebody that believes in climate change, but at the same time, like some of this data and the reporting and the communication of it is done in a very shady manner, which does call into question like what is actually going on here, when the transparency of it is so lacking, where you're literally creating your own language, you're creating your own specialists, you're creating this really unique thing that only you have the right to do, to analyze, to question, to think about. So once it's like super exclusive like that, then it does, and further away from the people, then it does kind of become a bit more sketchy in my eyes.
Well, and touching on that a bit, I don't know what exactly the IPC looks like or how it's run, but you have, my sense of it is you have academics across the globe that are specializing in different forms of climate research, and they're putting their findings out there. And the IPCC group of IPCC, thank you. It's a mouthful. I'm gonna probably screw it up more than once.
Same.
And it it's made up of highly educated people that know how to read these studies, read these reports, and present this latest report from the IPCC is a summary of all the latest research up to only 2000 and I don't know, is it 2020? It's not obviously they're always a little bit behind the latest cutting edge stuff, but the point is that group, I guess, decide how to create the language around it, and not to keep harping on this calibrated language for certainty, but I'm sorry, I just think it should be way more clear and just standardize their language. Like, I'm going to give you another example here. Basically, I'm seeing in these footnotes uses of language that basically overlap each other. So they have, for example, they'll say very likely means 90 to 100%, but they're also saying extremely likely means from 95 to 100%. And then more likely than not is greater than 50 up to 100%, and extremely unlikely is 0 to 5. And they say this may also be used when appropriate, but these kind of three extra language definitions overlap with other language definitions that they've used, which are for different ranges. And so you
have three terms to describe something that's likely. You have one term to describe something that's unlikely.
That's where I think it's biased. I think the bias, if the bias is anywhere, the bias is in favor of describing things that are likely to happen, even when the probability seems lower.
Because there's more language to describe it, right?
Right.
Literally, even if something is considered 33% likely, that's still likely in their eyes. Because
more likely than not.
So, bro, but that's a perfect example. Look at that. So they've literally captured to as low as 33%. So everything 33 and above is likely from their point of view. Is that crazy? That's fucking nuts.
It's crazy. It is. Yes.
That's fucking nuts.
Yes. It is kind of. Yes. Yeah.
Or more likely than not. Everything 33% and above is like, or more than likely, or more likely or not. Not more than likely. You see what I'm doing there?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny.
Well, yeah, and so, am I screwing this up? But for example, from 33 to 50 is 17%, right?
33 to 50?
To 50% is 17. But from 50 to 66,
16.
16.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, no, maybe I'm.
No, that's still 33% though. That's the important thing.
That's still
33 is the difference.
Is the difference?
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, it still seems like to say that call anything that happens under 50% as likely as not to happen, or over 50%.
Exactly.
It's just.
Again, you've
misleading.
Encapsulated more information into the likely camp versus the unlikely camp. And you have to remember, in statistics, it's all about how you group things, how do you categorize things, what are your little intervals, right? Do you set it for 10 gaps of 10, gaps of 20, gaps of 100, whatever, and it's all changes the results and things. So moving on, I want to touch on this point where it says of how scientists, policymakers have identified a red line if the plan is to avoid catastrophic and irreversible consequences. It's like, so are we at the red line or not? Are we at the red line or not? Because the next statement says the IPCC report found that many changes due to greenhouse gas emissions are already irreversible, such as melting glaciers, said the author. So are we at the reversible stage or are we at the unreversible stage? You know what I mean? Because, or is it irreversible or is it reversible? Because it's kind of like simultaneously sending both messages where, okay, we're past the red line, a bunch of stuff is here to stay, but we need to also act now so that we can avoid like these other changes as well. Or like, it's just kind of, they're sending the two messages at once, or maybe they're doing that on purpose just to say, oh, look, there's all this stuff that's happened and that's why we must act now. Maybe, like, I don't know, that's the only way that I could like think about it. But it just seems like they're sending both messages. Whoa, it's catastrophic. Like like we need to act now, but all this stuff is already kind of like baked into the cake, and we kind of can't do anything about it. I was like, okay, wait, what?
Yeah.
And so then, should we then actually be acting out in such ways that destroy economies for the future generations and put people into like indentured servitude and debt, like for something that you're not like 100% on? Like, I don't know. It's just,
well, that is the question, right? What response is justified? And what I have seen peripherally over the last 10 years is a discussion around these points of no return, where we, if we don't meet these targets, this is unreversible, this is not unreversible. And I don't think that has changed. I think even in the executive summary of this latest report, they're still talking about, okay, glaciers are still going to continue to melt even if we get our CO2 emissions and capture to net zero. Basically, we can reduce increases in mean ground temperature by or stabilize it at some 2 degrees, 3 degrees above pre-industrial times, but that's not going to stop these icebergs from melting. But so
it's like, what's the point? I go back to that. It's
right.
Like, right.
You got to ask yourself.
Like, you kind of
undercutting
your arguments here.
What is the point of doing anything crazy about it? And I think the most reasonable thing is that there is no justification to go crazy about it, and it's the concept of making it seem like there's a reason to go crazy about it is a way to push through policies, and the policies that might ultimately be helpful, but could also be very detrimental. And the thing is that let's expand this even to a bigger picture. So climate has never been stable on this planet, and so when they talk about irreversible, as in icebergs are going to still melt, that's not to say that in some 1,000 years we're not going to return to some sort of ice age under other conditions. It's just that in this kind of a more of immediate human driven time frame of 100 years, that there's no chance that we're going to
change it ourselves
due to our
actions.
Yes. Yeah.
We're not going to have the impact, the say, as our egotistical human desires push us towards the constant need for control. But yeah, so that's the thing that stood out to me, was that it's really mixed messaging. It's like we've reached the catastrophe, but yet we're not there, but we need to act now, but some stuff is already done. So the messaging seems off to me. And it says, even if current emission pledges are realized, they would amount to just a 1% reduction in global emissions by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. So again, we have that comparison to our baseline 2010 levels. Scientists say the number needs to be closer to 50% reduction. So it's like, okay, let me get this straight. Even if we hit all our current targets, so Paris Accord, whatever, all that stuff, you're just saying it's only going to be a 1% like impact. Buried in like paragraph 17 or whatever the hell.
Yeah, and
like, are you kidding me? and so we got to ramp it up to 50%. Again, the whole every crisis is an opportunity. Don't let any catastrophe go to waste. This is an opportunity for them to pass down policies which they have wanted to for a long period of time, but they were unable to. And now this is the chance to capitalize, strike while the iron is hot. My question to that previous statement, though would be, what is that, or in terms of the recourse would be that what we need is an analysis of where those emissions are coming from. So it's like, okay, cut emissions by 50%. Okay, to what? And then to what ends? And also, like, where we have to consider, because bulk chunk of those emissions, we have to be realistic, are coming from countries that are developing their economies, and they need to burn fossil fuels in order to get the energy. It's really that simple. We want to think in all these high and mighty terms, but fundamentally there's governments such as China, India, Nigeria, South Africa, southern parts of Africa that are developing economies, and they need to burn fossil fuels in order to give their people energy. Energy is like one of the fundamental components of life, right? And in terms of like the basic needs that you need in order to live a fulfilling life, you need to meet energy demands, your house, your warmth, energy. So these governments are accountable to their people. So what they're gonna like succumb to global environmentalists that say there's some impending climate catastrophe, but meanwhile they have to like shut down their fossil fuel burning coal power plants or whatever the hell they are that they use to actually support their people, support their citizens, give them energy, give them the fundamental requirement that they need to live their lives and get their work done. It's just like I don't know. Even again, reading the statement, if current pledges are realized, they would amount to just 1% reduction in global emissions compared to 2010 levels. We need 50% or reduction. Like, but then why is it to 2010 levels? Like again, like how did 2010 become the benchmark all of a sudden?
Yeah, the 2010 is weird. I've not heard that reference besides this article.
Washington Post, baby.
Washington Post. I'm not, but there must be a reason. There must be. But the thing is, this whole talk about, what we need to cut down to have a meaningful effect is so challenging because, like you said, when you read that, you say the current goals are not going to even do anything. So there's people that say, why bother do it? And then there's other people that say, see that we need 50% and they think we need to ramp it up and there's an urgency to do it. Now you can argue about why goals get set, whether there's obviously political motivations that have to do with maybe lobbying for oil and gas at one side, but there's also just, there must be discussions about what is even attainable, what is in the realm of possibility, like that doesn't put absolutely crazy stress, like you said, on people on countries that are developing and have, like, frankly cannot just do the best latest and greatest carbon capture techniques immediately on all other facilities. And then there's also a discussion about really how confident the different scientific groups in these countries agree with what the results of this IPCC report is. Because that's the other thing, like the part that we don't ever really hear about is a country might come to the table and say, we don't want to meet this goal as high as the IPCC report, because they've got another analysis that says that is frankly not going to be the case, or whatever. That is also,
or they have different priorities,
or they just got different priorities. And outside of addressing climate change is the be end all. Exactly. Which and frankly, I think it's more noble and ethical to not put climate change as your highest one, if you're putting other welfare for your citizens in different ways in a higher priority spot. It just makes more sense. But the extreme-minded person will read something like that and just laugh and go, oh yeah, politics is a joke, they're not even meeting the goal, and like, oh, it's gonna, and then things are gonna absolutely go to shit, and they're out there shouting about, oh, we need to meet these goals, and they have no idea how that would even be possible. They have no sense of what would be realistic for a solution, these people, but yet they're out there asking and demanding something that demanding the impossible, potentially,
without just the pragmatic, common sense look again of where are these emissions coming from. If we're looking at global emissions, then we have to look at global contributors. We have to look at all these countries. We have to look at the change, the patterns, how are things shifting, and again, with with countries developing. They're going to be burning more fossil fuels. I hate to break it to you, but their fossil fuels are going to be around for another many hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we just have to be realistic about these goals and how they're going to be reached. And if we do, and stop living in our high and mighty, pious, idealist, theoretical, hypothetical worlds, then we'll kind of come to our senses and realize these governments are accountable to their people. Their people will hold them accountable. So not freaking their international relations and these things. I mean, yeah, there's some international pressure that can be put.
Definitely.
Yeah, of course. But at the end of the day, China's going to do what's best for China. India's going to do what's best for India. Nigeria's going to do what's best for Nigeria. South Africa's going to do what's best for South Africa. Russia's going to do what's best for for Russia. And so on and so forth. So anyways, I don't want to harp on that point too much. I know we are a bit strapped for time. Elliot, you have to run. We've hit our time block for the day, guys. So
yeah,
there was
folks.
another article we wanted to look at, but I think this was a good opener to get the conversation rolling on this subject, on this theme, and we'll continue with more discussions along this nature, trying to look at the IPCC report, and tackle it from different points of view.
Love it.
Okay. All right. So we'll catch you guys next time on next episode of First Principles. And again, break it down from the ground up. Let's go.
Peace.
Peace out, guys.